My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and Defending Dissent Foundation, which is one of the three groups that has organized this panel. It was also organized by DC Jacobin, who did a lot of work to make it possible, as well as the DC National Lawyers Guild. I'm also one of the panelists, and I'm joined by three excellent panelists. Hendrik Voss, who's from the School of the Americas Watch. Yeah, Hendrik. Brandy Collins, who's from Color of Change. And Dr. Maha Halal, who's from the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedom. So I am just going to start by very briefly introducing the purpose of this panel and then segue seamlessly into my presentation. So the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and Defending Dissent Foundation, which is one of the groups that sponsored this panel, is not only an organization that works on political surveillance, we're an organization that was a victim of political surveillance. So we trace our founding back to the 1960s to the National Coalition to Abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee. And how that group came into being is a very interesting story, and if you indulge me for 1 minute, I will tell you. So there was this man named Frank Wilkinson who worked for the Los Angeles Public Housing Authority, and he was involved with designing a very innovative, progressive, integrated public housing program in Chavez Ravine. He had also, for the 10 years prior to this, been spied on by the FBI. By the end of the FBI's multi-decade-long surveillance on him, his file was longer than Dr. King's. It's 132,000 pages. A federal court finally put an injunction in 1986 telling the FBI to stop spying on him. So he had been spied on by the FBI up until this point, and he was testifying at trial at an eminent domain hearing on housing conditions against slumlords. And in what I believe economists technically refer to as the invisible hand of the free market, the FBI had given his FBI file to the lawyers for the developers. So while he's up there talking about like tuberculosis and housing conditions, the lawyers from the other side get up and start asking about his political affiliations, including his involvement with the Communist Party. Because unlike the FBI, he believed in the Bill of Rights, he refused to answer those questions. And as a result, he was impeached as a witness, he lost his job, he was called before the California Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, then called twice before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He went to jail for 9 months for refusing to answer questions about his political affiliations for them, because like HUAC, he also believed in the Constitution more than they did. And then Chavez Ravine became Dodger Stadium, and all the low-income tenants were evicted to build a baseball stadium. So you can thank the FBI for that as well. And then after this, he obviously did not like HUAC very much, so he helped to found the National Coalition to Abolish HUAC. And here's another interesting thing, was that since the FBI was spying on him, they knew he was doing this. So before the National Coalition to Abolish HUAC could go public with a press release, the FBI leaked information from their surveillance on them to HUAC, which then put out a press release about, like, these are all bad people, don't listen to them. Really great FBI story. And that's a story that I think we should think about tonight as we think about the role of the relationship between social movements and the surveillance state. So this panel came out of our Activism is Not Terrorism program, which the centerpiece of right now is a letter to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, which you can read over there. That's been signed by over 60 civil society groups, including all of the groups represented on this panel, calling on the House and Senate Judiciary Committees to investigate the FBI and the DHS's abuse of their counterterrorism authority to spy on Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, School of the Americas Watch, and Keystone Pipeline protesters. And you might ask why we picked those 4 groups, and that's because those are the 4 groups we know the FBI has spied on and DHS since 2010. And why 2010? That's because that's the year the Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General, issued a report on the FBI spying on other groups using its counterterrorism authorities inappropriate, and they clearly did not learn their lesson that time, so that would indicate that a lot stronger action needs to be taken against the FBI. So the theory behind the letter is that You know, all of us are involved in different social movements, peace movements, racial justice groups, etc., but we all have a common enemy in the surveillance state, and we're all not going to be able to achieve our aims if they continue to disrupt and infiltrate our movements. So what we're hoping to do is bring together groups to sort of build power against the surveillance state, to sort of build solidarity across movements and win a victory against the surveillance state. And it's evidenced by the fact that most of the 60-plus groups that signed this letter aren't civil liberties groups, they aren't First Amendment groups, they're trade unions, they're peace groups, they're environmental groups, they're racial justice groups, and other groups that recognize that what the FBI is doing is a threat to them. And I think that it's important tonight to not only think about the way in which the surveillance state threatens social movements, but the way in which social movements can take on the surveillance state. So in the 1970s, a group of about 8 anti-war activists broke into the office of the FBI and liberated some files, exposing the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which was meant to neutralize, disrupt, and otherwise eliminate groups the FBI didn't like. And as a result of this, the Church Committee happened, which was the major attempt at reforming the FBI, as well as the NSA and the CIA. But a couple decades earlier, the National Lawyers Guild had been putting together a report documenting the fact that the FBI was involved in political surveillance, illegal break-ins, and called black job break-ins, which is what we know from Watergate, but it's also what the FBI did to the left until at least the 70s, and most likely throughout the 1980s as well. Well, that's not 100% proven, it's pretty probable they were still doing it in the 80s. And that, you know, the response to this was that because the FBI was doing all of these things to the National Lawyers Guild, they knew they were going to come up with this report, so they ghost wrote a report for HUAC, and then HUAC published a report as their own, saying that the National Lawyers Guild was controlled by the Soviet Union, and as evidence of this, they cited that the National Lawyers Guild accuses the FBI of political spying, that the National Lawyers Guild wants to investigate the FBI, and that the National Lawyers Guild claims HUAC and the FBI work together, which all were evidence as fact by the very existence of this report. And I think the difference between the reaction to the NLG's revelations in the late 40s and the revelations in the late 70s is the early 70s. As the early 70s was the height of the anti-war movement, it was the height of the Black liberation movement, and you had very strong progressive social movements who recognized that, you know, the surveillance state represented a threat to them, and they were going to mobilize against it. And that's why Congress took action, not because they're nice people and, you know, out of their own benevolence gave us these things. And I think we should remember throughout the night that it's not just the surveillance state that's a threat to social movements are also a threat to the surveillance state. And on that note, I'm going to move on to my formal presentation, which is on a history of the FBI and their lovely shenanigans. So this is a very timely panel. There's very little we could have done to not make it timely because every week the FBI does something to violate the First Amendment. But last week, the FBI, along with the DHS and the Secret Service and the local police departments, started knocking on doors in Cleveland of activists, asking them what they plan to do to protest the Republican National Convention. The FBI confirmed they did this because they told The Intercept, we always cooperate with local communities. The FBI showing up your door is not cooperative. The intention behind it is really quite clear. For most people, if the FBI shows up at their front door and starts asking questions, they're going to feel intimidated. I'm a lawyer, I work on these issues every day. If the FBI knocks on my door tomorrow, I'm going to be pretty unnerved. So the question is, you know, why is the FBI doing this? Don't they have something, you know, better to do? You know, shouldn't they be looking at crime? And the answer to that question is that from its inception to the present, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is the political police of the United States of America. And that even for a lot of people who are critical of the FBI, who can catalog all the different FBI abuses, this point is often lost on them. And part of the reason why is we're told this narrative that, while very persuasive on face value, really obscures the role of the FBI as the political police. And this narrative has basically two parts. First part is pre-Church Committee. It's the FBI was doing all these bad things, but it was a long time ago. It was because Hoover was a bad guy, and then, Congress came in and they stopped, and then there's this mythical period where the FBI wasn't doing anything bad at all, and then 9/11 happens. And then after 9/11, the FBI is just overzealous about terrorism. They want to keep us safe, so they overreact, and they start going after, peaceful groups. The best story or fact that debunks this narrative is the fact that after the Church Committee, the second major attempt by Congress in reining the FBI happened in the 1980s because the FBI from '81 until the late '80s was investigating Central American Solidarity activists under the grounds they might be connected to terrorism. So we have, just 4 or 5 years after the Church Committee's over, we see the FBI back at its old tricks, and we have about 20 years for 9/11, them citing terrorism as a justification for doing so. And the terrorism justification is actually quite important because after 1976, there's new Attorney General guidelines that are meant to rein in political spying for the FBI and to limit their actions to legitimate activities like crime, terrorism, espionage. And Ivan Greenberg is a independent researcher who's followed a bunch of FOIA requests on groups we know the FBI spied on during the COINTELPRO days, asking for their files post-1976, and what he found was that a lot of these investigations continued under the new guidelines, just under new justification. So the Black Panther Party, after 1976, is investigated by the FBI as a counterterrorism investigation. The American Indian Movement is investigated after 1976 by the FBI as a counterterrorism investigation. The FBI can't decide whether or not they want to investigate the Socialist Worker Party, who they had previously gathered 8 million pages of files on, and to this day, because of the Supreme Court and the Federal Election Commission, don't have to disclose the names of their campaign contributors because, according to the FEC and the Supreme Court, doing so would put those people at risk of violence and harassment from law enforcement. So think about that for a minute. We live in a free society, and there is a group that competes in democratic elections that does not have to give the names of their members or contributors because law enforcement might harass them. The FBI couldn't decide. They let the Attorney General decide. He was at that point being sued by the Socialist Workers Party for civil rights violations, so he unsurprisingly decided to discontinue the investigation, which made most of their points in their lawsuit moot. The Communist Party is always sort of the people the FBI was most frequently after, and they were the people originally pursued after COINTELPRO. What we know is that post-76, they continued to investigate the Communist Party to at least 1990, only under their power to police espionage, as a counter-espionage investigation. So after the FBI has their powers to be the political police more openly taken from them, they continue to do so, but just somehow always finding a justification to do what they're always doing, using these new guidelines that to rein them in. And I think this raises the question as to, why is it so difficult to reform the FBI? Why do they keep going back to these same old tactics? And I really think, get to the root of that, you have to go back to when the FBI was formed. The predecessor to the FBI was the General Intelligence Division of the Department of Justice. It was headed by Hoover, became the FBI. If you go on the FBI's website, they will tell you the General Intelligence Division was also known as the Radical Division. So that should let you know who they were set up to police. They were set up to police anarchists and socialists during the Palmer raids. J. Edgar Hoover was picked to run this organization because he had been a librarian at the National Library of Congress and was very good at indexing things. He was put in charge of tracking left-wing groups and coming up with lists of their members' names, who then were raided and deported and arrested. And the FBI used various indexing things like this all throughout their history. In the 1930s, they got in trouble with Congress for doing this, and one member of Congress described what Hoover did as terror by index cards, which I found to be a particularly amusing quote. But, that there was a radical division, it's not just Hoover's personality. During this period of time, multiple large cities had red squads, which were units of the police department aimed at policing dissent. Like the FBI, their predecessor organizations oftentimes still exist under different names, but they're still spying on dissent, and that many states had passed criminal syndicalism and criminal anarchy laws, which were laws that basically made it illegal to engage in certain types of speech. So the FBI came into being at a time when it was considered legitimate to use state power to police and curtail dissent, and they came into being with that very purpose. And that's why we're sitting here in 2016, and they're using their counterterrorism authority to go after groups they know are nonviolent. And I'm going to conclude there, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Maha Halal. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for being here. I hope you can hear me. I'm a little bit sick and I'm fasting, so bear with me. So when I usually start my presentations, I like to use quotes by government officials because I think that in a lot of ways they sort of talk about what it is that we're describing in many of these panels. So in 2002, former President Bush said, "Ours is a war not against a religion, not against the Muslim faith, but ours is a war against individuals who absolutely hate what America stands for." So it's interesting because with that quote, President Bush is trying to make a distinction, right, in terms of these policies that are created that ostensibly didn't target all Muslims, but in reality, they did. And many of the policies that we've seen post 9/11 have done exactly that. So making this distinction does little to account for the reality of what happened post 9/11. So I'm going to talk a little bit about surveillance in terms of what has happened to the Muslim community in particular, and what's different in the sense of the context being social movements is that Muslims have been surveilled not because they are part of social movements, but just because they are Muslim, just by virtue of the religion that they adhere to. So Michael Foucault once said, "But the guilty person is only one of the targets of punishment. For punishment is directed above at all others, at all the potentially guilty." And that pretty much sums up the ways in which and the reasons for surveillance. So surveillance is not just targeted at the one person or the small community that's being surveilled. It's an attempt to make the entire community fearful. It's an attempt for the entire community to know that they're being targeted, and no matter what, even if you think there's a primary subject or a primary target, that you're also being watched, that you're also being followed. And what really is the point of surveillance when it comes to Muslims? The point is for Muslims to begin to self-regulate their behavior, right? When there is surveillance in the mosques, that would affect things like charitable giving, that affects the specific religious practices, that affects whether or not someone's actually going to go to the mosque. Because if you go to the mosque knowing that you're going to be surveilled, knowing that there's going to be informants, it becomes quite fearful. It becomes quite scary then to go to the mosque and know that this is happening. And not only going to the mosque, but knowing that you could be associated with someone else who is being actively surveilled. So these are all of the range of consequences that have happened because of this surveillance. And again, the surveillance is being done primarily by the FBI, right? The FBI employs a large number of informants to surveil the Muslim community. In fact, they now employ a roster of about 15,000 informants, and many of these informants are getting paid 6-digit figures. So imagine that earlier, say 20, 30 years ago, the numbers of informants were in the thousands, say 1,000, 2,000. But now we have 15,000 informants. And the claim that is made by government officials to suggest that, no, we're not in fact surveilling all the Muslims is that we can't quite possibly do that, right? But again, going back to what is the point of surveillance, the point of surveillance is not only to target and watch a specific group of people, it's to cause fear for the larger community. So the FBI doesn't in fact need to employ 25,000 or 30,000. The fact that they have 15,000 is enough to scare the entire Muslim community and for them to know that they are being watched. So Now, what I think of when I was trying to think about, who exactly in the Muslim community might be being surveilled more directly or more explicitly, I think there's kind of sort of three categories of Muslims. One are the good Muslims. Those are the ones that, adhere to the law, largely are conscientious of foreign policy, are in agreement with the US government's policy decisions, etc. Then there are the sort of problematic Muslims, the ones that are maybe activists, right? The ones that are trying to push back against some of these policies. The ones that are aware of what has happened in other countries because of US foreign policy. And then there are the bad Muslims, those are the terrorists. But in all three cases, they're all being surveilled. What the Muslim community has done to itself in many ways is to sort of internalize a lot of this, what I would call Islamophobia. And for the good Muslims in particular, to think that because they are, quote, good Muslims, they will not be subject to this type of surveillance or targeting, right? So that if they don't criticize US foreign policy, if they belong to a certain social status or class, that they will be immune from this type of surveillance. And the security state and the surveillance state has created this sort of dilemma, right? Where you think you might be targeted, but you don't really think you're going to be targeted. And that's what the good Muslims have to deal with. Then there's the problematic Muslims, so the ones that know that most likely they're being targeted, most likely they're being surveilled. They're not necessarily sure because nothing explicit has come out of it, but nonetheless they're being surveilled. And I think we could agree that the surveillance state is focused mostly on these sort of problematic Muslims, right? And then there are the bad Muslims, those are just the terrorists. And interestingly enough, even when these individuals, the quote, bad Muslims, are in prison, they're also being surveilled. So if you think about communication management units, for example, that involves extreme surveillance. So these are the individuals who have been charged with some terrorism-related charges, right? And they're held in these units, disproportionately Muslim, about 70%. And they're barred from having any contact visits with their families. If they talk to their families on the phone calls are surveilled. It's live surveillance, such that if a family member and the prisoner are speaking, the family member, if the person who's live surveilling doesn't hear what one of them said, they are asked to repeat what was said. So it's active awareness that there's this surveillance going on. So no matter where you fall on the spectrum of being Muslim, you're going to be surveilled. And if you're not being surveilled directly, again, it's the fear of being surveilled, which arguably is the same thing as being actually surveilled. So as I mentioned, in terms of the use of informants, there's been a proliferation in the use post 9/11. And what's important to note is that some of the informants, many of the informants, are essentially assigned just to target, just to surveil and infiltrate Muslim and Arab communities. This is not an accident, right? The FBI employs a number of informants across many different kinds of cases, but to have a category of informants that are specifically focused on the Muslim community is quite special, right? And especially because they're being surveilled because of their adherence to a particular faith, not necessarily because they even pose a threat in other contexts, in other terms, might actually constitute a threat to the surveillance state, but merely because of their religious beliefs, merely because they practice Islam. So what happens as a result, right? Muslim and Arab communities become distrustful of law enforcement. And why does that matter? Because when they become distrustful, they then are more reluctant to let FBI come into their communities, come into their mosques, and with reason, right? The FBI has informants. The FBI has not only utilized informants, but has come into the mosque doing, quote, community outreach programs where they've actually documented names of the participants in the room. But then when the community becomes distrustful and decides to act on this distrust, perhaps being more skeptical of the FBI reaching out, then that is even more reason for the FBI to surveil and target the community. At least that's what it is seen for the FBI. So it's a cyclical pattern of essentially state violence towards the Muslim community, where the FBI provokes this kind of fear, and when the fear actually is registered by the Muslim community, they react in such a way as to make them more prone, more susceptible to being surveilled even more. Now, the FBI is not alone. Many of you in this room have probably heard of the NYPD's project to surveil and map Muslim communities. They targeted, quote, mosques of concern based on ethnic orientation, ethnic orientation, leadership, and group affiliations. So the FBI, again, is not alone, and the NYPD has actually collaborated with the CIA to conduct these massive spying operations in the Muslim community in New York. And that's sort of one of the most egregious cases that we know about, but certainly not one of the last that we'll hear about. What many of the informant cases do as well is to basically plant operations and to try to carry out an operation with the Muslim individual by giving them the skills, the tools, the money, whatever is necessary to carry out an attack, and to continue to provoke the person and to provoke the person until they essentially agree to some sort of criminal activity. Has anyone here seen the film Terror? Okay, so just a handful of people, but the film Terror is a documentary that actually follows an active case that's being perpetrated by an informant. So the informant is following a Muslim person. The Muslim person is a little bit, I would say, negligent in their comments on Facebook. They congratulate Osama bin Laden. They do things like write about the Taliban, which under the U.S. Constitution could be free speech, right? But in this current climate, unfortunately, it's become unsafe for Muslims to make these sort of statements. So this individual then becomes a target of the FBI, and the informant continues to target him and tries to get him eventually to commit some act of violence, right? What happens then is that the actual individual who's being targeted becomes suspicious and contacts the organization for which I work, the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, and they kind of guide him through the process. Now, I won't tell you what happens at the end, but he does end up in prison, but it's not actually because of terrorism-related charges. It's actually for something else. So the FBI, in this case, failed. And this is what they do many, 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 many times. No matter what happens, it's either the person ends up in prison for terrorism-related charges, and for charges, for crimes that they could have never possibly committed in the absence of the FBI. So they either end up in prison for that reason, or for some other related reason. In the end, what happens is that the FBI is able to criminalize people that, had it not been for the FBI, would not have been in jail and would not have been in prison. So there's a book called The Terror Factory that actually looks at various cases of the use of informants and tries to actually go through all the terrorism cases that have been prosecuted by the U.S. government. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the findings. And I would encourage you all to read this if you're more interested in this topic. Again, the book is called The Terror Factory. So in the 508 defendants in terrorism-related cases, as defined by the Department of Justice, this investigation found that nearly half the prosecutions involved the use of informants. Sting operations resulted in prosecutions against 158 defendants. In many sting cases, key encounters between the informant and the target were not recorded. And that terrorism-related charges are really difficult to beat in court, that they're essentially almost impossible to beat in court. So consider the information that's being gathered. A lot of times the individual does agree to commit some act of violence. That's not necessarily what's in dispute. But what is in dispute is the fact that the FBI provocateur worked consistently to make the individual agree to committing this act of crime. The individual could have not had a single bone within him or her, right, to commit this act of violence, but yet here comes the FBI. This is their way of winning the war on terror, is to criminalize otherwise innocent people. And on the flip side, what's interesting is the plots that they haven't thwarted. So when it comes to the Boston bombers, for example, they had intelligence information to be able to track and monitor these individuals, but yet, instead of dedicating time and effort to continuing to follow these cases that actually may pose a threat, they instead opt to use time and resources to target otherwise innocent people, to target and create and manufacture cases where individuals then become the targets of terrorism-related charges. So there's an article by Sahar Aziz, which I'd also encourage you to read, called Caught in a Preventative Dragnet, and she talks extensively about many of these cases and specifically the use of informants. So there are a lot of consequences when it comes to the use of informants, not just those that I've mentioned in terms of targeting innocent individuals, but also just waste of resources. The FBI, again, is giving informants 6-digit salaries to conduct these operations, right? Another thing is that it creates distrust, like I mentioned, between the Muslim community and law enforcement. And this is across the board. So it's not just the FBI, but the entire US government. There's significant distrust. How do you work with the DHS when you know that the FBI is creating these informant operations within your community? How can you possibly trust the US government? Now, another thing is that because of the ways in which the surveillance state has operated within the Muslim community, it also socially constructs Muslims as disloyal. Because what other social construction can you derive when the entire Muslim community is essentially being surveilled? What signal does that send to society? That we need to track and monitor the Muslim community and that they are all inherently suspicious, right? And a couple of other things that would seem obvious to this audience is that freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech is a consequence of the use of informants. How are you going to feel free to exercise your right to free speech when you're in the mosque giving a sermon and you know that there are FBI informants in the room? And I can tell you that, as a matter of fact, there are a number of mosques in the Virginia area, in the DC area, Maryland area, where there are active informants in the community. And they attend the Friday prayers, they attend religious functions, to the point where many times religious leaders often greet them almost sarcastically. Like, hello, FBI informants, we know you're here. Welcome. So freedom of speech is definitely hampered. In one of the cases, Craig Montilla was an informant in California. He conducted a number of cases. He would leave a pair of keys that had recording devices in them around the mosque so that he could watch and surveil and monitor the conversations that were happening. So how is it possible to have free speech within the boundaries of the mosque, within the Muslim community, if you know that this is happening? Furthermore, there's the free exercise of religion. Now, I think this is important to emphasize, not only because it's an obvious one, but also because of the sort of less obvious piece of this, which is that we don't have research that talks about what happens when FBI informants are penetrating the mosque spaces and the Muslim spaces. We don't know how many people are refusing or not coming to these spaces because of FBI informants, because of the fear of the surveillance operation. We don't have that information. So we don't know how many people's right to the free exercise of religion is being violated because we don't have that data. We don't know. We don't know how to track people that are no longer coming to the Muslim community, to these spaces, to be part of the community, because we don't know who they are. Freedom of association, another consequence. If essentially you know that you're being surveilled and targeted and monitored because of your adherence to the Islamic faith and because of your association to other Muslims or with other Muslims, how then is your freedom of association being protected? If, because you are communicating with and being in similar spaces with the Muslim community, and as a result you're being targeted and monitored, how is your right to freedom of association being protected? It's not. And that's what one of the consequences has been. And lastly, freedom of expression. These are all sort of part of the same body of rights, but when it comes to the Muslim community, it's important to think about the ways in which these rights have been violated, in particular when it comes to these religious spaces. And because religious expression, religious freedom is held to be sort of a bedrock principle in the United States, right? That's sort of the story of the premise on which this country was founded, was this idea of religious freedom. Yet, when it comes to the war on terror, we haven't seen Muslims being given this right, and the right is being denied time and time again. Now, two other less obvious consequences are something called internment of the psyche. That's a concept that was coined by Nadine Never, and it's the idea of basically feeling that you're always under the radar, right? And that's, again, I've talked about this earlier in the talk, but just feeling like you're always being monitored and being surveilled. And that's what it feels like to be in the surveillance state, particularly as a Muslim. There are many times I, for example, have refrained from utilizing certain Google searches, from looking up certain terms, even though I was doing it for research reasons, because I was afraid of what would happen. Would I be surveilled? Well, I'm probably being surveilled. Would I continue to be surveilled? And to what extent would this be happening if I chose to do research on certain topics? So I simply don't. And another concept coined by Hatem Bazian is the idea of virtual internment. And he writes that virtual internment can best be defined as a quasi-visible but repressive, intimidating, and confining structure employed by the U.S. administration and its allies on a global scale against individuals, communities, and organizations deemed unsupportive and possibly hostile in their worldview toward American and global interests. So two very similar concepts, basically aimed at describing what it is that is the larger consequences of the war on terror, and in particular, the surveillance state. I want to sort of say one last thing about the case of Hassan versus the City of New York, which is something, a case I mentioned earlier in terms of the NYPD surveilling the Muslim community. And what I thought was really interesting about the case is the fact that initially the case was denied because the plaintiffs could not provide injury in fact. In other words, the fact that their rights were violated was not enough for them to win the case. It's not enough to be under suspicionless, warrantless surveillance. But you have to prove that there was harm, which there was harm, psychological harm, emotional harm. But nonetheless, that was not enough for the state to accept as as personal injury. What would be personal injury, and how would you even know that? How would you know, for example, now that these individuals have been involved in the case, what if they applied for a job and they knew that the employer knew that these people had previously been surveilled by the NYPD and CIA? Would the employer tell them, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you this job because we know you were being surveilled? Absolutely not. So the fact that the government used this threshold to determine whether or not there was some sort of injury is egregious. And that's one of the most disturbing problems and disturbing facts of this war on terror and surveillance state. The case was successfully appealed, and so there is hope in terms of what will transpire. But the initial case was disturbing and problematic enough as it was. So the last thing I want to talk about is just what my organization in particular does. So again, my organization is called the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, and we work specifically to push back against post-9/11 policies that have largely targeted Muslims and Arabs. And more specifically, we try to directly support prisoners and their families. So these are prisoners that have terrorism-related charges, such as material support for terrorism, being involved in entrapment cases, being part of sting operations, that kind of thing. And one of the things we do is we have a pen pal program where we write letters to prisoners. We also have a Ramadan gifts program, being that it is that most of the prisoners are Muslim, where we send $100 commissary funds to the prisoners during Ramadan so they're able to enjoy certain things like dates or other culturally relevant foods. And in terms of the families of the prisoners, who are often very stigmatized and suffer greatly, whether it's socioeconomically or otherwise, we have families conferences once a year in which we bring the families together and try to support and facilitate a space for healing and skills building. So that's the work of our organization, and really it was created by a former political prisoner, Samir Aryan, who personally experienced the consequences of being Muslim American activist post 9/11. So I will stop at that, but I'm happy to answer any questions post talk.
Thanks everyone. My name is Brandy Collins. As mentioned, I am the campaign director at Color Change. Since they paid for my trip to sunny DC, I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So they're a nearly 11-year-old organization. They started in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Their founders, our founders, Van Jones and James Rucker, were watching television, like many of us, watching people, mostly poor folks, mostly black folks, literally and figuratively drowning. And it seemed like there was just no accountability, that nobody was really concerned about letting down black folks. And a lot of the activism in that space was more geared towards these sort of immediate short-term relief, as opposed to, sort of preventing the next Katrina or the next, Flint or next disaster, which is part natural disaster, but really compounded by years, decades of government neglect. And so from there, James and Van sent out an email to everyone in their Rolodex. I've heard different things, but I think it's about 1,000 folks. And the subject line was basically, Kanye was right. And then, different subject line now. But since then, we've grown to about 1 million members, over 1 million members. We work to change the structures that disproportionately harm marginalized communities. We want to challenge what we call sort of profiteers of pain. So in other words, when our communities suffer, who are the ones that benefit? And we use a form of what we call citizen lobbying that allows folks to engage in a lot of different activities to hold government and corporations accountable to us. We're also, we have C3 sort of nonprofit status, but we're also, I believe, the largest Black civil rights group to have C4 status, which means we are allowed to lobby folks, officials directly, which comes in handy right about now. Most recently, we launched an initiative called Organize For, which allows different grassroots groups and organizers to start their own petitions in order to scale up and build power in their communities, in order to develop digital organizers for the 21st century. And it varies across issue area. Actually, this weekend I was in North Carolina and helped a mother whose son was gunned down by a police officer create her own petition, both to bring justice for her son and also to help bring police accountability. So she said no one else could go through what she went through. So that's a little bit about us and some of the work that we do. Some of the work that I particularly do, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I oversee our media, economic, and environmental justice departments. Particularly, I want to talk a little bit about the work around media accountability because it plays into part of what brings us here. So last year we drafted a report called Not to Be Trusted, and it looked at the role of local news in perpetuating certain myths about our communities. We went to different regions. The first one is in New York, the next one is in Chicago. We examined what we see as the role of media as functioning as a PR firm for police departments and building the case for over-policing and surveillance in our communities. What we essentially found in New York is that Black crime was being overreported in the news by 25 percentage points, while white crime was being significantly underreported. What we wanted to do in that report was illuminate how different narratives get created in our communities that then justify certain policies, justify certain behavior treatments, disproportionate or disparate treatment in patients, certain treatment in housing and other issues. We wanted to sort of disrupt this frame that Black folks or people of color are the problem, as opposed to the fact that we operate under a system that allows for deep inequities. And so that brings us partially to why we're here today. So I want to once again pick on the good old NYPD, because we love them, right? One of the largest police departments in the country. NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton said last year that we were seeing a dawning age of technology and promised to equip every officer in NYC with police technology, the likes of which we've never seen. Much of this technology is explicitly tied to surveillance and being able to monitor individuals and communities. The ones we know about include drones, Stingray devices, predictive policing software, license plate readers, biometrics data. It goes on and on. A lot of this technology is proven to be something of a shapeshifter, in which it's evolved so much, and there's new technology being developed. And so we see all of this being rolled out to police departments, and further news of how police departments are working with, and if need be, around tech companies, sort of further fuel the concern around the role of big data in the age of digital surveillance. About a month after Bratton talked about this dawning era of technology, he told one audience in a surprisingly candid speech that since the days of slavery, the stories of police and black citizens have been intertwined, and that the unequal nature of that relationship could not be denied. I know, you're like, shocking, right? Yeah, me too. I was like, for real, he said that? And then he went back to, targeting black folks, but whatever. And indeed, it can't be denied upon looking at the history of policing in the US. From the beginning. Even, let's take the South for example. The genesis of the modern police organizations in the South were explicitly slave patrols in the early 1700s. These slave patrols or early police departments had three primary functions. One, to chase down, apprehend, and return to owners, runaway slaves, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers. Following the Civil War, these same departments evolved into modern southern police departments, which served as a means of controlling freed slaves who were now laborers and enforcing Jim Crow segregation laws. So though Bratton only explicitly spoke of this story of black folks, we know, we've heard, and we feel that this story is true of a lot of marginalized communities. Latino, Native, or Arab American, new immigrant communities throughout history have stories of being racially or ethnically profiled and subjected to high levels of government-sanctioned violence. So we often talk about like the 50s or the 60s or COINTELPRO, but this goes back, so much further than that. Data collected by journalists and activists show that despite the fact today that non-white Americans make up less than 38% of the US population, they account for nearly half of all people killed by police and make up almost 2/3 of unarmed folks killed by police. So these two parallel stories of surveillance and police brutality are not disconnected, and nor are they confined to the boroughs of New York City. Across the country, police departments of various size, budget, and training are beefing up their surveillance technology, getting access to equipment gifted to them from the military. This, combined with its disturbing history of institutional structural racism, runs the risk of reinforcing existing biases in our society with direct and deadly consequences to communities of color. And as the doctor alluded to, despite the fact that we're told that our behaviors trigger surveillance, what feels true is that actually our identity triggers surveillance. Being poor, being a person of color, being all sorts of things trigger a higher level of scrutiny. And that's both when we're talking about mass and targeted surveillance. One example I often like to use is, it's not so recent anymore, but the news out of Maryland that all the buses were equipped with audiovisual equipment and were able to collect information on everyone riding them. We know that actually most public transportation in this country are equipped with surveillance. We also know, according to transportation data, that 60% of the people that ride public transportation are people of color, and even more of them are people below a certain income level. So once again, just your identity is triggering this higher level of surveillance. As Chip said eloquently, much like the story of race and policing, the story of government surveillance as a means of social control also has this long history. My friend Hamid Khan from Stop LAPD Spying often talks, shout out, often talks of the Chicago Haymarket Uprising of 1886 as a turning point in the history of American labor movement and policing. After the clash between police and protesters fighting for the 8-hour workdays, the Chicago Police Department said that revolutionary movements had to be crushed when showing signs of strength. And the result of that, as Chip talked about, were these red squads, or police unions that specialized in targeting and disbanding labor unions. From that point on, we've seen mass-scale union busting, which hit its low with the rise of McCarthyism and COINTELPRO, which, as many of us know, kept files on MLK and Cesar Chavez. One can only wonder, I think, how history would be different had social justice movements not been aggressively snuffed out over time. Stop LAPD Spying also has a really kind of breathtaking timeline of both surveillance throughout the US and specifically in LA that goes back to the 1700s. And I would encourage folks to check them out because they're doing a lot of interesting stuff around surveillance. But today we are witnessing a burgeoning millennial-driven civil rights movement. The new movement is powered by the internet, and social media serves not only as a vital tool for organizing, but also as a 24-hour news outlet, forcing public disclosure about discrimination and challenging predominant mainstream media narratives. Grassroots activism and online organizing have come together to amplify the voices of marginalized communities, leverage the systemic change, and strengthen our democracy. But with that technology, as we know, it opens up the door to an astonishing level of government surveillance, again, the likes of which we've never seen. This level of surveillance without transparency could have absolutely a crippling effect on movements for change. And this isn't just speculation rooted in history, right? In August 2015, emails from the Department of Homeland Security revealed that the activities of activists were being monitored. This news was shocking to no one, at least not anyone that's doing any work, as there have been like multiple documented instances of people in various movements being tracked and monitored. And we know that since 9/11, DHS has given more than $34 billion to law enforcement, in part for high-tech surveillance and tracking. Unfortunately, for everything we don't know, there's so much we don't know. For everything we do know, there's so much we don't know about the depth and level to which government surveillance is taking place in our movements. The veil of secrecy under which the government surveillance operates prevents us from ascertaining, documenting, and really troubleshooting the harms to our community, something, again, that the doctor talked about. So let me tell you a little bit more about some of the stuff we've heard on the ground. Some of it has been documented, and I think what I really want to say, I can't say enough, the power of sort of alternative journalism, because we've been able to see some incredible things be documented that still aren't being reported in mainstream outlets. Like occasionally you might see a Washington Post article, but really like The Intercept in these times, Vice, some other different outlets have really done a really detailed job of documenting some of this stuff. So some of it we've obtained through news outlets, and some of it we've heard talking to folks. It's almost like folklore being passed on from activist to activist as a warning of what's happening in our communities. So Chip talked about what was happening in Cleveland and Philly. We've also heard about activists being arbitrarily arrested at events or arrested for something like jaywalking. Their phone is confiscated, their SIM card and SD cards are physically removed or clearly tampered with and then returned to them. Some of the things we've also heard are from activists here in DC attempting to film police harassment and live stream it and having it be scrambled or jammed up so they couldn't report it. We've heard out of Chicago the use of stingrays. In these times has an amazing article that I reference all the time. I think it's called To Whom We Surveil or something like that. That talks about use of surveillance and gave an example of the teachers' unions in Chicago that were being surveilled around the public school strike a few years back, which to me, coming from like a family of teachers that are all like kind of little old people, it's like hard for me to imagine why they're being surveilled in that way. But again, you know, this piece around, you know, crushing dissident voices is very real. We've heard about people being stopped and pulled out of line during protests, and they're not necessarily at the front as leaders, right? They're sometimes blended in with the community, but they're immediately identified as being a leader. Guns being held to their head, people being torn away, mothers being torn away from their children while they're screaming, people being referred to not by their actual name, but by their social media handle. Protesters in Minneapolis being catfished by security guards or police at the Mall of America. We heard multiple stories out of Ferguson and other places that I felt like sounded like something out of the 60s. People being picked up while they're up shopping at Walmart or something, not even engaging in their constitutionally protected right of protesting, but just out doing their thing. Being picked up by the police and taken on, you know, these sort of night rides and dropped off on the other side of the community. People just consistently being harassed. And on top of that is this media piece that I talk about, right? So as these people we know are being harassed on the street, more and more there's this media coverage that talks about police officers referring to Black Lives Matter as a terrorist threat, this sort of so-called Ferguson effect, We're activists fighting for equity and preventing police officers from doing their job and causing crime to go up. These kind of like false narratives that begin to make it feel clear to us that these things are not happening in isolation. They're not a coincidence, they're not an accident. We were at, I think you were there, a Color of Surveillance conference some time ago. And there was someone from the FBI there, very brave soul, that came into this like anti-surveillance space and talked about how he'd learned so much, they had learned so much, the FBI, from Martin Luther King, and they had taken that as a lesson. They dismantled COINTELPRO, and they were doing so much better now. And kind of thought, yeah, the only lesson you learned is maybe how to cover your tracks better, but it's fine. But we know that what we're seeing now is actually even more dangerous than COINTELPRO. So from there, we launched what we called the FOIA Project for Safe Activism, which is what I want to talk about in my last moments here. So we created this project that's in 4 phases. It's built around this idea of putting in FOIA requests on behalf of activists and looking at different events, but really we want it to be a little bit more holistic than that. So some of the questions that we were wondering, or that we feel, but that we want a little more tangible proof around is, are local police departments acting of their own volition, or are they working by themselves, or are they working in connection with federal government? If so, how are different governments collaborating, and what does that look like? What are the tools being used, and how can we protect ourselves? So from there, we kind of created this project, which deploys what we do, which is like, it incorporates rapid response action campaigns with research, with the FOIA requests, and with building tools for activists and anyone in their community to protect themselves. So we've deployed a couple of national campaigns. The first one that we did was one around supporting the Mall of America activists that were surveilled. We did some targeting surveillance done by the NYPD. We've done work around the prosecution of protesters in LA and Oakland. We've also launched a campaign around stingrays calling for a public registry, even though we want to see them dismantled. We're working with somebody to develop this app, which hopefully will be finished soon, which will allow folks, when uploaded, to sort of document the likelihood of different stingrays in their vicinity and create a heat map that basically shows where all the stingrays are, so that we can begin to open up the curtain on, just how much stingrays are being used. We also have a petition right now making sure that the FBI isn't able to get an exemption for its facial recognition database, the next generation identification system from key transparency requirements in the Privacy Act. So we're also looking for different opportunities to run other campaigns based on license plate readers, fusion centers, suspicious activity reporting, etc. But basically what we want to do is, I think, create this like tapestry of both actions and stories that talk about what surveillance looks like of activists today. We want to give people an opportunity to both not just tell their story, but intervene and take action. So we're also archiving anecdotes and stories, and we're leveraging research as well as these different actions. We've started to build and convene a network of attorneys of color to provide on-the-ground support to activists, and also to solidify partnerships we have to gather more. We're also working with groups on tech research, encryption, and with other social justice activists in training different activists on how to protect themselves while they're out in the field. Also, a lot of folks out there, a lot of groups that we work with have put in FOIA requests on actual events. We're working with a group of activists to put in actual FOIA requests on them. And what we wanted to do is not just put them in on like kind of the folks that everyone knows. We wanted to get a full range. So we have activists that are on the front line. We have activists that are less known, but would definitely be on the radar of police. Folks that have been doing this work for decades. Folks that might have just used hashtag Black Lives Matter a few times on their Facebook page. And we wanted to really gauge the full range of what that surveillance then looks like. So I think, we're kind of moving forward with this work, and we've started to hear back on our FOIA requests. So I think to close out, I want to talk a little bit, if I can find my notes, about some of the things that we have gotten that from the government. Unfortunately, this has been a super hard-going process. So I want to say also, too, that one of the things we did around our FOIA request is that we put it in as a political piece of content. So we wrote in there that, you know, all of these things that we believe, all of the things that we've seen documented, all the things we want to know. We're planning on sort of starting to publicly release the names of the activists we're working with starting July 5th, which is, I think, the anniversary of the FOIA Act, or something having to do with FOIA, yeah, something like that. And we're hoping, we've been like putting in this information for a while, and as we're getting data back, hoping to release all the results around, I think, the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panthers this fall. So some of the things that we've heard in the first round, and we put it in with DHS, FBI, and local police departments. So in the first round with the ones with the DHS, they told us they could only search emails that they had with specific email addresses. And we were actually, fortunately, we've been working with journalist outlets that called BS on that, so we were able to go back and challenge that. The second thing we heard was that you have to put in, I don't know if other folks have looked at FOIA requests, but we had to put in keywords. And we put in keywords like Black Lives Matters, and we heard back that they don't have Black Lives Matters in their database, which we also think is BS. So we're currently challenging that. So if there's folks in this room or other folks that have had a similar experience, we'd love to talk to y'all and see what that means. So we're continuing to plug away at this. We're hoping, we're basically working up to filing a lawsuit against the government for the unwarranted surveillance of the movement for Black Lives. So if we don't get that data one way, we'll try to get it another. So that's a little bit about the work that we're doing, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks so much to the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the Defending Dissent Foundation, DC Jacobin, and the DC National Lawyers Guild for putting this forum on, because it's really important, I think, to have this kind of information out, and I think also that it's every few years that we need to remind ourselves about what the FBI is and what the FBI does, that it is a political police force. And it's, I mean, it has been throughout the years, throughout the decades, as the speakers before me already have talked about, is that the FBI has been used to squash dissent, to go after communities of color. And this, we have to really dig into that and make that an issue and really push back against that to work for self-determination for our communities. My name is Henrik Voss. I work with School of the Americas Watch. We are, for those of you who don't know SOA Watch, we are an organization. We started out to shut down the US Army School of the Americas. It was during the Civil War in El Salvador, where the United States was pouring in $1 million every day to prop up the regime and to fund despots who were going against social movements, against organizers, against everybody who was working for the rights of the poor, and to impose US dominance over El Salvador. And it was at that time, while there was one big massacre that was very high profile in El Salvador, at that anniversary, people gathered at the gates of Fort Benning, Georgia, where the School of the Americas is located, to call for the closure of the school and to call for a stop of US intervention in Central America. Over the years, the work of SOA Watch has branched out, and also the repression in Latin America is still ongoing, is still continuing. It's not as much in the news today, but it's, for example, Honduras, there was in 2009, the democratically elected government was overthrown by graduates of the School of the Americas because they were also going towards a new project, a different way of dealing with things. The president was trying to raise the minimum wage, was trying to start a constitutional assembly where the people were supposed to decide for themselves what their future is going to look like. And I'll say one thing that Brandy said that resonated with me was about how different would the world look today if the social justice movements would have been allowed to succeed or would have succeeded, and if people wouldn't have been taken out here in the United States and also in Latin America, where tens or hundreds of thousands of people have been killed by US violence, by US militarism. And there were a lot of good beginnings and a lot of creativity, a lot of great ideas, a lot of energy that has been squashed by US repression. Also in Mexico is another example where since 2008, under the guise of the war on drugs, the US has poured in millions and millions of military aid, military training, and it's tens of thousands of people have died, have been killed. And it's the US is just pouring more fuel into the fire. And the whole idea of US foreign policy is that they can solve social problems with military means. And it's the same thing also then, the whole mindset also is the same thing in the US, that they're using violence, that communities are being over-policed, that there's just more infusion of violence, more infusion of militarized police forces, militarized police to keep communities down, and instead of addressing the problems that are there. So, with School of the Americas Watch, we have had this vigil at the gates of Fort Benning, where the School of the Americas is located, since 1990. And in the first years, we had a series of direct actions also that was directed at the military base, where people went onto the base, were going into the building of the school, were pouring their blood over the pictures of dictators and human rights abusers that were put up there. People dropped banners from the water tower, went onto the base in uniforms of high-ranking military officers so they could go to the barracks where the soldiers were located, were playing speeches of people who were murdered by graduates of the SOA. And in the beginning, we didn't have a big problem with the local police in Columbus, Georgia, where the base is located. In the beginning, they very much just directed the traffic, and that was quite okay with us. And it was not until 2000, when the anti-globalization movement came up, that the FBI came in to brief the local police department about who we are and what to expect from us. And also at that point, the local police force was a lot more open to us, and they were, once the FBI came in with their team and was telling them about these potential terrorist threats that are coming in and that people might attack the police and all these. They also said that there would be this group from Arizona, which is the EZLN, which is coming to join the protest. So they were very much fear-mongering, and it had a big impact on the local police, because then at that point also the whole attitude of the local police towards us switched. That at that point the local police started to have infiltrators who came into our events, who were at points even almost starting fights with people, who were very aggressive. And so over the years, so there were several instances. One incident in 2010 was when people were trying to leave the vigil site where the protest was taking place. The police started to arrest people who were leaving, and also went after specific organizers who were on the sidewalk and arrested them. And at that point, we filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, because we wanted to know how those decisions were being made, who was behind it. So we filed FOIAs with a lot of different agencies, local police forces, state police forces, and also the FBI. And it was the end of last year that we received 420 pages from the FBI, from the Atlanta field office of the FBI, that dealt with SOA Watch. And those documents showed that SOA Watch was moved up in the year of 2000 from regular to a priority for the FBI, and also we were moved up to counter-terrorism surveillance. So that the counter-terrorism division of the FBI was dealing with School of the Americas Watch, and they did that for at least 10 years, at least that's what we have files about. And it showed that they had infiltrators, informants in the movement, were collecting information on SOA Watch, were spying on us, had people who were coming to meetings, were giving reports back to the FBI. And all those reports came back that they were saying that it's a peaceful event, it's a political protest event, but they still came back year after year with the excuse that they said, oh, maybe at some point there might be some violent elements that might infiltrate the protest. But with that excuse, you could infiltrate everything in any organization, because anywhere something might happen at some point in the future. They also said they designated the November Vigil as a special events readiness level event, which then involves a local law enforcement cooperation with Secret Service and Department of Homeland Security. Also in those documents it was very clear that the FBI works very closely with military intelligence, and also that they are sharing information there. And also I think that fits into the whole mindset that they are taking the political protests and as a police matter, that this is something that needs to be dealt with the FBI, with police resources, and not as a political problem. So yeah, we are really grateful also to the Defending Dissent Foundation Bill of Rights Committee, who after we received all this information through help with also Partnership for Civil Justice here in DC, some social justice lawyers who have done a lot of great work with Freedom of Information Act requests, and who really have pushed back against FBI surveillance, against FBI repression, yeah, very successfully, and have done a lot of great work. So the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, Defending Dissent Foundation invited us to come along to different meetings with different members of Congress to really also push back for our rights here. And we are grateful to be part of that, grateful to be part of a bigger movement to push back. And also there we really want to do that as in coalition with a lot of other groups who are targeted here in the United States. And it's also knowing that it's especially communities of color and the Muslim community today who are threatened by the FBI. And there was one incident when we talked to Representative Nadler's office, and also we're bringing up making the connection, and the aide to Representative Nadler was saying, oh, maybe you want to stay away from connecting with Muslim communities because of the perception that is out there. So, and also we have a lot of education to do within our own movement, and also then within broader society to really stand united on this, to really push back against FBI surveillance and against state repression. And I think now we also want to leave enough time for question and answers, and also for comments from you all.